The roar that had been shaking the grounds of Indian Wells all week was suddenly gone, replaced by an eerie quiet that fell over the stadium. For a second, Stadium 1 felt completely still, like over 16,000 people had forgotten to breathe all at once. Around, the Globe broadcasters and sports sites were already calling it, marking down the win for Linda Nuskova in the official draw. But in that arena, the moment felt heavier, packed with so much more emotion. For Alexandra Eala, the incredible young phenom who had set the entire tournament on fire with her amazing run, the fairy tale was over. The final point played out with agonizing slowness. Nuskova's return hit the net cord and just trickled over to Eala's side, ending the match in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. You could feel the emotion hang in the desert air as the crowd processed what they just saw. Instantly, social media feeds around the world lit up, but nobody was just talking about the score. What truly moved millions was the picture of Alexandra Eala at the net, standing motionless, her shoulders barely shaking as she accepted that the historic title her country had been praying for wasn't going to happen today. But the story behind that single moment was one of pure grit. Eala didn't just lose. She had gone to war in a brutal fight from the very first serve to the very last point, never giving up a single inch of that court. People who were courtside later mentioned that even Nuskova seemed shocked. Not just that she'd won, but by the relentless fight Eala put up through the entire match. When they finally met at the net for the handshake, TV cameras caught a brief conversation that went viral. Insiders reported that Nuskova leaned in close and whispered it was like playing against a machine out there. But to the thousands of Filipino supporters there, the famous Pinoy Army, Eala was anything but a machine. She stood for something far greater. She was their hero, a source of national pride, a young woman carrying the hopes of her people with every powerful swing. Back home in the Philippines, millions had been up all night, glued to their screens, living and dying with every point. Her unbelievable performance at Indian Wells was already a legendary chapter in the country's sports history, giving hope to fans who'd never seen one of their own compete at such a high level on the world stage. But maybe the most powerful scene happened as she walked off the court, as Eala grabbed her gear and started for the exit tunnel. She stopped for just a second and glanced up at the crowd. An ocean of Philippine flags waved right back at her, with fans cheering, clapping, and yelling their support. It was too much for her. You could see her wiping tears from her eyes as she gave the crowd one last wave. Those weren't tears of failure, though. They were tears that came from the immense pride of carrying a nation's dreams, the gut-wrenching feeling of getting so close, and the unbreakable connection she had with the country that had her back. As the stadium lights began to fade, one thing was certain: this was not how Alexandra Eala's story ends. For everyone watching, it felt like this was just the beginning of something truly special. A new fire in tennis. Word coming from the Indian Wells grounds was that the electric atmosphere in Stadium 1 had a profound effect on everyone, including the tournament staff. Usually the second a match is over, you see people heading for the exits. But not tonight. Something incredible took place. A sea of thousands stayed put, refusing to leave. They were on their feet, the entire stadium echoing with chants of Alexandra Eala's name. Her name carried on the desert wind as the stadium lights started to go down. It was a rolling tide of applause from a crowd that knew it had seen history. For countless people watching, this was about more than just who won or lost. A seasoned tennis commentator was said to have turned to his colleague with a quiet but significant comment. "I've covered championship wins here that got less of a reaction than what Alex Eala just got for losing." Deep in the exclusive VIP tunnel under the stands, the feeling was just as powerful, but much more subdued. Eyewitnesses say the legendary Rafael Nadal was positioned by the entrance, waiting for the players to come off the court. His face was reportedly a mix of pride and a subtle sorrow. When Eala at last came into view, a towel concealing part of her face, Nadal didn't offer any coaching tips or break down the game. He just moved toward her with his arms wide open. Their hug was a quiet gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. The official score might have shown a defeat, but it was obvious Eala had secured a much greater victory. The deep respect and admiration of everyone in the sport. Her incredible performance at Indian Wells was more than just over. It had captivated a nation, becoming a source of immense pride for millions back in the Philippines. Slowly the stands cleared out. The roar of the crowd died down to a murmur, and a quiet stillness returned to the desert night. But for so many of her fans, particularly the dedicated Filipino contingent known as the Pinoy Army, the end of the match left a profound emotional void. In the deep tunnels below, the silence was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the thunderous crowd just moments before. As Alexandra Eala made her way Through the bare concrete hallways under the grandstands, the weight of what had just happened really started to sink in. Once she passed through the heavy soundproof doors to the exclusive players' lounge, the world outside went completely silent. On the TV broadcast, the cameras had already cut away to Linda Nuskova's post-game interview, but the true drama was happening far from any lens. Sources from inside the locker room said that as soon as Ella was securely inside, the private quarters away from the public eye and the rolling cameras, she finally let go of the powerful emotions she'd been bottling up ever since the match ended. It's a feeling that's truly unique to competitors. That complex cocktail of total exhaustion, crushing disappointment, immense pride, and steely resolve that hits when you've left it all out there and still come up short. And so in that secluded area under the stadium, Alexandra Eala's run at Indian Wells concluded not as a loss, but as a clear sign that her chapter in the world of tennis was just getting started. This was about more than just the sting of one loss. It was the cathartic release that follows weeks of non-stop grueling effort, the crushing weight of global expectations, and the relentless intensity of playing on a world stage. Word from inside the players' lounge at the Indian Wells Open was that Alexandra Eala had tucked herself away in a quiet corner of the locker room, hiding her face under a towel emblazoned with the colors of the Philippines. She remained that way almost entirely still for close to 20 minutes. This was the same athlete who had just taken down some of the sport's biggest names, the one who had captured the hearts of the crowd and completely upended the tournament's storyline. But now, she was just a 20-year-old girl shouldering the emotional burden of her millions of fans. But then something no one saw coming unfolded. Eyewitnesses reported a sudden shift in the room's energy as a well-known face appeared quietly in the entrance. The low chatter died down and the staff fell silent out of instinct as the legendary Rafael Nadal stepped inside. Nadal had been a central figure in shaping Ella's career over the last few years. What he did next, however, wasn't about strategy or offering pointers on her technique. He didn't come in to give a big speech or rehash the match. Instead, Rafa simply walked over and sat on the floor, right next to her. It was a small act, but it resonated with the silent power of a champion who knew the mental war of professional tennis. Like few others. People who were there said Nadal's words were brief and murmured, in Spanish just loud enough for her to hear. "The world will only remember the score. Alex," he supposedly said, "but I saw your fight. This wasn't a defeat. This was the start of something much greater." Those present recall how Eala finally slowly raised her head, her eyes still puffy and red. That's when Nadal reached out and gave her a small, scuffed-up tennis ball. It was the very same one they'd hit back and forth during one of their late-night practices just days before the tournament began, a session that insiders had lovingly dubbed the Sun and Stars Midnight Practice. To an outsider, it was just a piece of felt and rubber, but for Eala, it was loaded with significance. It served as a tangible reminder that her path was never going to be defined by one tournament or one loss. This was all part of a bigger picture about improving, building resilience, and embarking on the long journey to the top. The work for what lay ahead was already underway, even in this moment of loss. At the same time, right outside those locker room doors, a very different kind of discussion was taking place. Sources say tournament directors and other high-level executives were already deep in conversation about the unbelievable impact Eala had on the entire competition. Because even though she was now out of the running, one fact was impossible to ignore. They called it the Eala effect, the massive wave of international media. The incredible fan engagement and the fresh buzz she brought to the women's tour didn't just vanish when the match was over. In fact, it seemed to be getting even more powerful. According to chatter making its way around the grounds of Indian Wells, television viewership numbers took a sharp and immediate downturn soon after Alexandra Eala left the court. For countless fans across the globe, her underdog story had been the main event, the anchor, holding their attention. And once that narrative was finished, the entire vibe of the tournament seemed to change on a dime. Back in the executive suites, the atmosphere was said to have become noticeably anxious. Investors and organizers, including the tournament's billionaire owner Larry Ellison, who had been a major force behind its push for a bigger global footprint, were all talking about the abrupt loss of steam. Insiders mentioned a flurry of hastily called meetings as the top brass tried to quantify exactly how much star power Ella had been injecting into their event. One source familiar with word from those talks painted a stark picture: the life of the tournament simply walked off the court with Alex. The groundswell of emotion that began in the locker room quickly spilled out well beyond the stadium's confines. On social Media platforms everywhere, fans started sharing messages of solidarity clips, of her greatest plays and their own raw feelings about her incredible run coming to an end. In the broadcast booth, the crew tried to steer the conversation back to the other matches still on the schedule, but anyone watching could tell the entire feel of the event had just changed. Before long, news started trickling in that the ticket resale sites for Indian Wells were seeing some wild swings. Prices for seats at the later rounds were said to be dropping as fans who had journeyed there just for a chance to see Eala play realized she was out of the running for the finals. From the exclusive hospitality suites overlooking the courts, the sponsors and big-name corporate partners were reportedly keeping a very close eye on things. The prevailing wisdom was that the massive buzz surrounding Eala was going to shatter engagement records and draw a whole new, international viewership to the sport. But now all the online chatter was centered on the heart-wrenching story of her departure. One source even said it was as if someone had pulled the plug quietly, draining the energy from the whole tournament. Eyewitnesses would later say they saw Larry Ellison deep in what looked like a heated conversation with officials from the Women's Tennis Association, pointing out the now empty blocks of seats that had, just hours before, held some of the most passionate fans in tennis. For so many people working behind the scenes, a heavy truth was starting to sink in. Alexandra Eala wasn't just another competitor making her way through the tournament. She had turned into the main event, the star attraction. Her games brought in enormous crowds, sparked powerful emotions from fans, and grabbed headlines around the world. With her name off the roster, the vibe across the huge desert venue felt completely off, as if the very heart of the excitement had just been ripped out. But maybe the most powerful moment of the whole evening happened far from any camera crew. Well, after the bright stadium lights went dark and the crowd started shuffling back to their cars and hotels, a remarkable scene was taking shape just outside the main gates. As the desert night grew cold over Indian Wells, the devotion of Eala's fans burned as brightly as ever. Word is that hundreds, maybe even thousands of Filipino supporters had gathered quietly by the player exit. Many clutched small flags of the Philippines. Others just stood there shoulder to shoulder. This wasn't a protest, and it wasn't born from anger. It was something else entirely. A vigil born out of the moment. These fans were just waiting, hoping to get one last look at the athlete who had so completely won them over in one amazing week of tennis. Just beyond the gates of the Indian Wells Open, the scene became even more charged with emotion as the night wore on. Her supporters, known lovingly as the Pinoy Army, started holding up their phones, their lights transforming the darkness into a galaxy of tiny twinkling stars. You could hear some of them softly singing national anthems. Many others just waved their little Filipino flags, chanting the name Alexandra Eala into the night. It was a sight you just don't see in professional sports. Even the security team folks who have seen it all were said to have stopped just to take it in. One seasoned consultant would later comment, "In my 30 years covering major sporting events, I have never witnessed an entire country rally behind a player who had just been defeated." And that incredible outpouring of support definitely caught the attention of the rest of the tennis world. Word is a number of other players were watching the whole scene from their hotel balconies, stunned by the sheer devotion coming from Eala's fans. It was dawning on everyone that this tournament had been about something more than just tennis. Regardless of what the scoreboard said, Alexandra Eala had forged something incredibly rare in modern sports, a genuine emotional bond with people all over the world. At the same time, up in a hotel suite there in Indian Wells, Eala herself was supposedly at her window, gazing down at the scattered lights of the supporters who had gathered. For her, while the sting of the loss hadn't faded, that feeling of disappointment was slowly starting to morph into something new, pure determination. Those in her inner circle later claimed that this moment didn't feel like the end of the road. On the contrary, it felt like the quiet start of something much bigger. As she stared out at her supporters braving the cool desert air, it's said that Eala quietly vowed to herself that she would use this painful moment as the very fuel for her comeback. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a soul-crushing loss, but in her own mind, the next chapter was already underway. The brutal 6-2-6-0 scoreboard from her match against Linda Nuskova may have completely killed the momentum she had built. However, the fighting spirit that had powered her through the tournament was a long way from being snuffed out. While the world's sports media was busy analyzing her strategy and what she needed to fix technically, something much more important was supposedly unfolding behind closed doors, in the stillness of that California evening. According to insiders, one of the game's greatest legends was paying close attention. Tennis icon Martina Navratilova, who had already complimented Eala's intelligence and court awareness, did more than just watch from the sidelines. Sources say she got in touch with Eala's team directly not long after the match ended. That private message immediately started making waves within the tight-knit tennis community. People familiar with the exchange said Navratilova offered a blunt but deeply encouraging take. Her advice, from what we hear, was crystal clear. The loss wasn't really about the player on the other side of the net. It was about the crushing weight of expectation that Alexandra Eala had been forced to carry throughout the whole tournament. The tennis star's message was direct and deeply empathetic. According to people who heard about their talk, Martina Navratilova reminded Alexandra Eala that no young player should have to bear the burden of an entire nation on their back. If she truly wanted to improve and push past this, Navratilova apparently told her she had to let go of all that pressure and find the simple joy that made her fall in love with the sport to begin with. That piece of raw, honest advice seemed to strike a chord deep inside Eala, because instead of packing up and leaving the Indian Wells Open right after being knocked out, she reportedly slipped back onto the practice courts late that same night, long after the other players had gone back to their hotels. Eala was reportedly already back on the court, laser-focused on the one part of her game that gave her trouble. During the match, her serve. Onlookers saw a player practicing with raw intensity and grit, going through the motions again and again under the glow of the quiet desert lights. That loss to Linda Nuskova had stung, no doubt, but it also ignited a fire within her, a relentless drive to get better. At the same time, news of Navratilovan's words of support began making the rounds among the tour's coaches and athletes. Throughout the professional tennis community, the takeaway was undeniable. And Alexandra Eala, with this kind of motivation, was a far greater threat than ever. One seasoned coach was said to have put it bluntly. While everyone else was talking about the loss, Eala herself was already over it. Instead of getting stuck on the defeat, she was back on the court, getting ready for the next battle on her schedule. In the players' lounge at Indian Wells, hushed conversations about what was next for her were already starting. Many on the tour knew this story was nowhere near its conclusion. In fact, a growing number felt that the tennis world hadn't just seen the high point of Eala's journey, but merely the start of it. On social media, the buzz among her followers was only getting louder. Her fans especially. Her incredibly dedicated Filipino supporters, known as the Pinoy Army, were already booking flights and buying up tickets for her upcoming matches at the Miami Open. Back in the Philippines, the initial sting of her defeat was rapidly giving way to eager anticipation for what was on the horizon, especially with the clay court season just around the corner. Later that night, once her practice was done, Eala supposedly packed her gear and gave her team a calm look. A source who was there on the court said she made a quiet, but incredibly potent statement. "The dragon is just shedding its skin," she said. "The world thinks the dream is over, but it's really just evolving." By the next morning, the entire vibe at the 2026 Indian Wells Open had noticeably changed. Sure, the scoreboard in Stadium 1 told the official story of her match, but to the countless onlookers, fans, analysts, and her peers alike, Alexandra Eala's incredible performance had already cemented its place in the tournament's history. And if the buzz around the tennis world was anything to go by, this chapter wasn't the end. It was just the prologue to a much grander epic yet to be written. While most of the media was busy dissecting the match's technical details, something far more profound was happening away from the cameras, deep inside the executive offices of the Indian Wells Open. Sources revealed the tournament owner, Larry Ellison, had been profoundly affected by the unbelievable passion the fans displayed during Alexandra Eala's string of victories. Witnesses claim Ellison had a quick encounter with Eala's team in a private corridor right after the match. It was a brief exchange, but everyone there said it felt incredibly genuine. Ellison apparently conveyed his deep respect for the way Eala had transformed the energy of the whole tournament. According to those who heard the conversation, he noted that while winning is always the goal in pro sports, the power a player has to electrify the very soul of an event can sometimes be just as important. To everyone at the tournament, Eala was undeniably the story of the week, but the real emotional climax of her journey wouldn't happen until hours later. Just as the desert sky started to glow with the first hint of morning, Eala was getting ready to head out of Indian Wells for her next tournament, the Miami Open, but something incredible was waiting for her just outside the hotel doors. A huge crowd of her fans had been there all night, refusing to sleep. These weren't journalists or tournament staff. They were her people, her fans. Many of them were waving small flags from the Philippines, while others had their phones out hoping to get one final picture of the athlete, who had captured their hearts all week. In the cool air just before sunrise, the quiet of the desert streets was shattered by a powerful chant from the crowd. Alex, Alex, Alex. By all accounts, what she did next stunned even those in her inner circle. Instead of just giving a quick wave from the car, she reportedly told the driver to pull over. She got out of the vehicle and turned to face the supporters who had given up their night for her. She just stood there for a long moment, completely still, absorbing the entire scene. Witnesses reported seeing tears welling up in her eyes. But this wasn't about losing. It was pure pride. Speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, Ella gave a brief statement that instantly went viral online. "This isn't the end," she declared. "It's a new beginning. My country sent me here for more than just to compete. They sent me here to win, and I'll be back." For so many people watching, that single, powerful moment was the perfect summary of her entire journey at Indian Wells. Of course, the official results had been logged,